I'd like to begin my story with my father's story. My father was one of 18 children who grew up in a little town called Marianna in Arkansas. My father was a young black boy growing up in the South at a time when the South was racially very volatile and segregated. And one of the experiences that I think of and that I often share as part of my father's story and now my story is about another little black boy who spent time in the South called Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young man, young boy, who was from Chicago and went to Mississippi to visit family. He was accused of whistling at a white girl on the street, and later that night he was taken from his great uncle's house in the middle of the night. He was beaten and brutalized. His body was tied, his dead body was tied to a cotton gin, and he was found several days later, his bloated body floating in the river. His parents allowed his body to be viewed, open casket funeral, as a message to other big mamas, women who had young boys in the South, that this is what they're doing to young black boys in the South. It was around that time that Emmett Till was a contemporary of my father, that my father migrated with so many other young black boys and with so many other black folks to the north, and how my father ended up in a suburb of Chicago. And for the first time at that young and impressionable part of his life, he was expected to interact with people who were white. Coming from a very segregated, racially hostile situation, going to a much more integrated north, and where there were actually opportunities to have and start building relationships with people across racial lines, was a pretty important developmental milestone for him. I think it also, in my experience of him, left a strong impression about his own safety and how it is that he needs to make sure that he provides for his own safety and in the safety of his family by trying to be in integrated environments as much as possible, not stand out, stay under the radar. My mother, in a very similar fashion, grew up in a very large family, but in a suburb of Illinois, a city called Zion. She was one of 10 children, socioeconomically not well off at all. She was a Jehovah's Witness. So she was in a community that was primarily African American and Puerto Rican. So my mother always felt like a bit of an outsider, racially and ethnically speaking, from a religious point of view. And she was one of many in a large family. And so my mother, in addition to my father, though they came through very different realities, both had, I think, in my understanding of their stories, feelings of kind of isolation, even though they're surrounded by people, and feelings of misgivings about one's own identity in the context within which they were expected to not just thrive, hopefully, but survive at least. They got together and had me and my sisters. And so my sisters, there are 4 of us total, I'm the oldest, grew up as biracial children during an era when biracial people weren't really acknowledged yet. There wasn't really a place or a name or a core group of us. We weren't, Halle Berry and Tiger Woods, they weren't in style yet when I was growing up. And my mother and father, as an interracial couple, definitely were trying to find their way, even in a northern city where interracial relationships were still really frowned upon. I remember a story going to a family funeral in Arkansas and driving from Chicago to Arkansas. My mother, my father, my sisters, and I. We got pulled over by the police one night in the middle of the night on our road trip. My father was taken to jail for being in the car with my mother, his wife, and his children. He was arrested and detained for being a black man with a white woman all those years after the Emmett Till situation. Those were the kinds of impressions that so formed my understanding of race and identity, not just the stories of my parents as young people, but also the continued experiences that I had and the new experiences that I had related to race and ethnicity as a young person with my parents and as part of my own identity development conversation, let alone formulation. Fast forward, I ended up in school, at college, at Colorado State University. Going to college was a stroke of luck. I wasn't academically prepared to go to college. I don't know if I was academically as qualified as I should have been, but somehow I got there. The forces of the universe conspired in my favor to get me to college. And I got there, and I just was still really wrestling with this notion of identity development, this notion of understanding race and ethnicity and my place in the world. And I say race and ethnicity because that's all I had really grappled with so far. That's it. I understood the world through racial lenses. And I understood the world through economic lenses as a person who grew up in sometimes extremely poor situations, and as a person who grew up as a member of a marginalized religious group. So the lenses through which I saw the world were relatively narrow and few, and I got to college and was overwhelmed with data and experiences of otherness that didn't fit into the relatively narrow worldview that I had developed up until then. Fortunately, I was able to meet and make lasting relationships with people who early on became my mentors and have continued to mentor me since. One of the people who stands out above others is a woman named Barb Kistler, who was a leadership and diversity educator at the university, but she was also a person who helped me give language to the experience that I was going through at that point in my life, who helped me understand that my feelings were valid and that there was something productive that I could do with my feelings. She and her influence connected to the influences and experiences and relationships developed with a lot of other people at that point in my life really put me on the path of becoming a human rights advocate. She and others helped me understand that I am a multidimensional being, that I am not just a racial being, that I am not just a religiously marginalized being, that I am not just a poor person in a mid-class or upper middle class environment now that I'm at college. She helped me kind of move my experience, in the famous words of Bell Hooks, from margin to center, to be able to say, this is the reality now that I understand and can give name to, and then to find a way to contribute to it in a very constructive and productive and healthy way. And that is the work of human rights advocates and allies, and the work that I stepped into.